the Book of Hope, which has been curated by the Better India. These are stories of resolve, love, faith, compassion, and entrepreneurship that will uplift your spirit. We have on stage Poonam, Dhimant, and Sandeep, who will talk with us more about it. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Dhimant Parekh, and I'm along with me is Poonam, Kasturi, and Sandeep Farias. And we're going to be talking about the Book of Hope. If you haven't yet seen this, it's available downstairs. You should definitely get a copy. The Book of Hope is actually a manifestation, one of the manifestations of what the Better India has been doing. You know, the idea for us has been, how do you use the power of storytelling to not only inspire people, but also to drive large-scale social impact, right? And before I proceed, I will want both Poonam and Sandeep to just quickly introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Poonam, and I run this company called Daily Dump that helps people compost at home, and we're based out of Bangalore. And thanks, Dhimant, for having me on the panel.
Hi, my name is Sandeep Farias. I'm part of an equity fund called Elevar Equity. Full disclosure, we've invested in Dhimant. So,
thanks for that. I think that was very, very quick, though. I must kind of tell you about Poonam. You know, she single-handedly spearheaded the whole composting movement across India, and especially in Bangalore. The chances that if you're composting at home, you're more likely to be using a Daily Dump product. So fantastic change that she's brought about in the city. Sandeep, of course, while he just said that in brief, he has been the force behind a lot of companies that have actually brought in change for lower income communities. And for us personally, of course, he's been one of the big believers in what we've been doing at the Better India and has been supporting us for many years now. So having said that, I think the way I want to kind of structure this is, of course, we'll be keeping it free, and if you guys have any questions, happy to take them. But the idea was for me to kind of give a little more of a background on why we do what we do, why this book exists, what is the purpose, and then I would get into some sort of a question and answer session with both Poonam and Sandeep, who have seen tremendous impact happen along their careers. So the Better India started really with a very, very sort of a very different vision we had, that if you want to drive large scale change in society, right, how do you do that? The question was that, and we believed that in order to bring large scale change, you need to build a community get a community of people together, and then you can mobilize this community for various social causes. But then the question became, how do you bring a community together? And the answer for us was that it's through the power of stories, right? When you actually put out stories of hope, inspiration, and so on, you're starting to change mindsets, you're starting to influence people. And through that, you can actually start driving change. One of the early stages when we kind of really took that pivot in saying that this is what we want to do is when Anuradha and I, Anuradha is my co-founder, she's right here. Anuradha and I used to do this as a side project on weekends, where we would go around Bangalore writing stories about people making a difference and just put them up, right? But I distinctly remember when the real kind of shift happened, even in our perception of how big this could be, was way back in 2015. We did a story about a group of farmers in the Vidarbha region. This is North Maharashtra, very arid, a lot of adversity. I was a group of 4 or 5 farmers who at that point were using WhatsApp to share information with each other and counsel each other. And this is early phases of WhatsApp, right? It was not as ubiquitous as it is today. So it was a fascinating thing that farmers in Vidarbha are using this to counsel each other. So we just wrote that story and we just put it up, online, and it was written in English. And slowly that story started doing the rounds. And eventually it went to the district magistrate of that area. And he was just blown away. So he actually called 1,200 farmers of his entire district. He got them all in one place. He put up a projector and he narrated our story in Marathi to 1,200 farmers. And that group of 5 had a group, there were 200 groups created. The group was called Bali Raja, that's what they called it. And there were Bali Raja 200, from Bali Raja 1 to Bali Raja 200. And all these farmers were there. Information sharing happened. And all of this, to me, and rather, I think the revelation that publishing something in English in an online digital space and the impact happening on 1,200 farmers in Vidarbha was just fascinating. And that really was our point where we said that this is something that we really, really need to scale and take it. And since then, of course, we've come a long way. And, this book has 30 of the most amazing stories, but I'll just kind of stop there. And, I'd love to ask Sandeep, in your career of having been a part, like a driving force of so many impact-focused companies, we'd love to hear from you how you've seen stories and storytelling, drive change.
Boy, that's, I think it's all about stories. We're an early stage investor. You meet an entrepreneur, you have a 30-minute, 45-minute, 60-minute discussion. Actually, it's a story at that point of time. A lot of our investing conviction comes from time that we spend in the field. So I'll give you one of my first stories. And I think since you've done one of your first, this was, I was visiting a very, very early stage microfinance institution. This would be probably around about 2005 or something like that. And landed up with this particular woman borrower who had started off with, I think, a 6,000 rupee loan. And then over 3 years had gone up from 6,000 to 8,000 to 10,000, and I think to a 12,000 rupee loan. So she'd actually been in the microfinance space for a little while. And what was amazing was she started by taking the loan for X activity, which was essentially dairy. And by the time she was in the third or the fourth loan, she had actually diversified into a kirana store, which she ran out of her house. She had started stitching clothes and started to employ people. Now, entrepreneurship, I think, is a complex issue, and not everybody can be an entrepreneur, but for large swaths of India and many parts of the world, I think it's a compulsion. That is the way you live. And I think being able to tap into that kind of an inspiration fundamentally, this is a B school, what she did. I mean, you diversified, you launched new products, you employed people. I mean, people go and spend a lot of money to learn this, and she just naturally and instinctively built that. And I think for us, much of what we've done at Elevar Equity has been finding entrepreneurs who have that kind of inspiration, but then also them working with people who are very entrepreneurial or doing inspirational work, and how do you fuel that kind of social and economic activity. But it's ultimately, everything's about a story. You invest in a story, they are providing some kind of a product or service to a story. And, sometimes we call ourselves human-centered, and the only reason we say that is because they're narratives. That's it.
Yeah, I think at the end of it all, it really is about stories, right? Even the conversation we're having here. So I'd love to get Poonam, you've seen so much change that from when you started Daily Dump, right? For 15 years. And now you've seen where it's come so far. And this whole sustainability environment campaign that you've been basically driving, how has that journey been? And what has really stood out for you in terms of the change that that has told you that, wow, this is something that I should continue doing?
You're talking, yeah. So to take a point about stories, right? When you're working in an area of sustainability, even you choose one thing, like if I've chosen composting, right? The final objective is the same thing. It doesn't change. It didn't change last 15 years. It's still the same. But you have to retell those stories. You have to refresh those stories. It's almost like you have to say the same story in a different way all the time. And we watched ourselves, right? When we first started, nobody wanted to buy composters. So I'm just going to ask the audience, anybody over here who doesn't compost? And who's hesitant? Anybody? Yeah? Okay, I saw a hand no. Now, you're very young, so maybe but if I came to your house and talked to your mom, and I tried to convince her about composting, I'd have to tell her a story. And maybe the story on that day would I want to tell, and I have to have this repertoire of stories, would be like, you have a fridge in your house, ma'am, you have a TV, you enjoy the fridge, you enjoy the TV, great, wonderful. But you know what the fridge does? And your mom would say, it keeps my food fresh and it's a very important part of my house. And I say, actually, no, the fridge delays death. And so that way of telling the story starts off a conversation. And that conversation is what finally can get two people who are opposite sides to be on the same side. So then your mom comes over to our side and says, okay, maybe I need to compost because you're giving me this whole thing about my tomato is delayed, my fridge is delaying death of my tomato. And you're telling me my composter brings life to my dead tomato. So I say, if you have a fridge, you should also have a composter. One gives delays death, one gives life, regenerates life. So this is one kind of story. But let me tell you, the story came out after trying many stories. And I think I would agree with Dhimant. Stories create impact. The way you tell the story, who you tell it to, the audience. And that actually gets me to ask Dhimant the question. While I was reading the book, Dhimant, I was very intrigued that you got, gender issues, you got feminism, you got food, and you had a whole diversity. There's even one thing about an elder child, which I found fascinating. So how did you choose these stories for the book?
That's a good question. When this book when the idea of the book came along, we realized that we actually have about 30,000, 40,000 stories published over the years. Right? It's a lot across so many categories. And we started then thinking about what should this book be about, right? At one point, we were thinking we could just focus on sustainability. At one point, we thought we could just focus on women empowerment because we have enough material on each of these topics. But when we started thinking about this at a broader level, we realized that what we want to make this about is the whole concept that stories can drive change. And it need not be about one topic, right? So that's when we decided that we actually should pick across categories that we have done, but really pick stories that can make you sit up and think and say, you know what, even I could do this, right? This is something that I can also bring about change. And that's really where we started from. And then as we started thinking about the categories and we started looking at, our website in general, what are people reading? What is it that people love reading? So got a lot of data from there. And then eventually put together, this compilation. In fact, many of these stories have not been published on the Better India, so they are unique to the book. It's a year in the making, but yeah, that was the reason why we chose all these categories.
I also think that the stories are very heartwarming, And I remember there was this whole series of chicken soup for the soul kind of thing. But I always felt when I was read it, it's so non-contextual to our context, right? And I find that was one thing I really enjoyed about the book. It's just that it's part of our culture and our context, and it's got all these very diverse people. It was like I could see the map of India. Stories from all places in India.
Yeah. In fact, the chicken soup for the soul was one of the things as a brief that we told the publisher that we don't want to make it like that, because we really wanted to make it more tangible in terms of and relatable in terms of impact. So if you actually read these stories, these are real people, right? This is not fiction. This is real people facing real circumstances and have done what they've done. So there are about 30 stories in this, 12 authors from our team. So if one of the things I've always been curious to understand is also that, so we think about the fact that if you want to bring about change, a large chunk of the thought process behind that is that the largest scale of impact can only be if you're with the government, right? And here we've been trying to bring a bottom-up approach of change. What's your view in that, in terms of how can different models of impact exist? How should society look at it? How should governments look at this? Like, what would you say? How should impact as a force be structured in society? Is that only government? Is it NGOs? Like, how can they all coexist?
I think very interesting question. Well, let's start with the Better India itself. I mean, today, how many readers on a monthly? What are your stats like?
200 million.
Want to take the mic?
Yes,
250
we have over
million.
250 million people who read
Okay.
us.
What was it about 4 years ago?
Yeah, it was over 30 million.
30 million. So that scale, which is fairly dramatic. The way I think about it is the problems and the challenges that are being faced on the ground are just so immense and so complicated that at some level, this either or approach, I think, is a fundamental problem. There is space for all kinds of approaches. I think the government is clearly a critical component and probably the most relevant when it comes to the poorest of the poor at a fundamental level. I think it's also the space where NGOs tend to function. I think one of the great things that is not spoken about is the extent of innovation that exists within the nonprofit world. And many of those innovations over time have actually landed up being, scale has been built, actually as they moved over into the for-profit world, so to speak. But that fundamental innovation took place within the nonprofit context. So while I operate certainly in a for-profit approach to development and to equitable consequences, I don't like this either or construct. I think the problems and challenges are just so acute. The real issue that we need to address is what is a small idea which then can be very powerful and that can scale, and how do you build that? And I think there the answer may vary within government, within nonprofits, and let's say enterprise at some fundamental level. So you take your own journey and going from 30 to 250 million, we're talking about close to 10 times of a growth at some fundamental level. It all starts by actually getting a fundamental idea in place and then just replicating, and then consequently building the scale as a consequence. So for me, irrespective of any kind of approach, it is that replication which is very, very important. But this is all boring talk. I mean, let's face it. I think the real magic, and I think to Poonam's point, really comes down to the fact that you have to constantly rewrite what you are doing, even though what you're doing is not changing at all. If you give me another minute, there's a WhatsApp group in the agriculture context, and there was a passing comment made in that group, and they exchange information on agriculture. And they said that agriculture always looks very cool on the Better India. It's not that cool in reality or that easy in reality. And I was reflecting about that comment. I think it completely missed something very, very fundamental. At some level, you can agree with that comment that all these stories are wonderful, but they're real. And I think they ignore that aspect. But I think there's a chain, which I think is very, very interesting. And I think that's where scale and impact really comes from. Is you start with the problem statement, which leads to an individual inspiration. I think there is purpose, there is inspiration at a very individual level. You typically will run into adversity as a consequence. And if you read these 30 stories or the 30,000 on your website, there is an adversity which gets built immediately. That adversity leads to a certain resilience. And then once you cross that resilience, then you see that purpose getting fulfilled. But in the meantime, you've probably, each entrepreneur, each individual down this path has built their own 30,000 stories as a consequence. And I think that's what that comment completely missed. So I thought I should take that comment on since you called me and asked me to be part of this panel. So, but let's flip the question back to you. 30,000 stories, 40,000 stories. How many stories do you think you've missed? And so how do you even pick there between what you've missed, etc.? Because almost every human has his own story or her own story as a consequence. So what's your filter?
No, that's a great question, right? And I think over 1 billion people and over 1 billion stories, in fact, billion into 10x, all of us have multiple stories in terms of everything that we've done. All of us has at some point or the other done something which is truly inspirational for others to kind of see. And from that whole sort of ocean, we're at 30,000 stories, kind of seems very, very like the work is still not done, right? And in fact, I still remember when we started talking about the book, and the commissioning editor from Penguin actually said that the Better India is an archive of a nation's collective goodness. That's how she kind of put it. That it's what you guys are doing is actually collecting the entire country's goodness and putting
nice story there. So
right, and I was like, that's such a big sort of a statement to make, because we just started. We just have these 30, 40,000 stories, 50,000 stories. So there's so much more to do and so much more to kind of achieve. Of course, today, in terms of, we have a crazy influx of stories that come in our way, like, hundreds of emails coming in every day, hundreds of tweets and Facebook comments and Instagram comments and all of that. And so obviously it becomes even tougher for us in terms of saying that, the signal to noise ratio kind of, right? How do you kind of do that? And so we have this team. The bottleneck, of course, is the size of the team and how much can you kind of expand and how fast you kind of expand. But the mission is that how do you document every single innovation, every single inspiration that has happened in the country? How can people who want to start composting today, is there a place that they can go and see how 10 other people have done it in 10 different regions, which are not amenable to where they stay? Or, in Bangalore, composting works differently. In Rajasthan, it works differently. How do we kind of capture all of that and make it easy for people to kind of access? Is definitely is a path we're still on, but that's a great question in terms of where the, how wide the field is. So yeah, Poonam, any thoughts on that?
I don't think the story catching, like dream catching, right, needs to be that you can't obsess about that. I don't think you have to obsess about the numbers that you've left behind. Sorry. I think the act of catching those stories itself, and whatever comes your way, right, is powerful enough. Thinking about what you've missed is not relevant. I think
I wasn't asking the question that way, but I think you make a valid point.
Yeah. So that fact that you're catching these stories and you're winnowing them and you're collecting them itself is the joy of it. And I think that's what I love about Better India. It's like it's a place for getting inspired. It's another. You're looking at a fellow human traveler and saying, "Oh boy, now that is something. That is either courage or resilience or laughter or whatever." And that's important. That's good enough. I mean, the numbers I wouldn't worry about.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's more from a numbers perspective, but in terms of how many more people's stories I think we should try and capture, right? I think that actually brings me to this point, and I think this was the third or the fourth week of starting the Better India, okay? And this is and the reason why I'm coming from Poonam's conversation is about the story of one person, and which might seem very minuscule as I'll narrate this. This was a story we did about a photography club run by visually impaired people. That was a fascinating story, right? They actually go with cameras, but they take photos by listening. Right? So there's beautiful photographs of pigeons flying and doors shutting, and because it's all sound-based frames that they've done. So that was a fascinating story, and we just put it up. And 2 weeks later, we actually had a visually impaired girl who reached out to Anu and me. That time it was just two of us, and she actually told us that we completely changed her life. This is just one person, right? Nothing to do with large-scale impact, nothing. Just one person coming up to us and saying, "You've completely transformed my life." She's visually impaired, and she said, "All my life I was wanting to do photography. That was in my head. It was I could visualize it, but whenever I would tell it to my parents or my friends, and they would be like, 'What a ridiculous thought! You're blind.' And then someone told me about this, what you guys have published, and I've gone and joined that photography club, and you completely transform her." And that power of one, at that point, we were just blown away that a story could to change for that one person. This was the world. For us, of course, this was just the starting of trying to cover so many stories. But that, I think, was also one of those initial moments when we realized that there's something there that we should dig deeper into, kind of pulling this out. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about this one person coming up to us and saying how that I don't even know if many people read that article. It was just way back, maybe like a few 20, 30 people read it, but that one person whom it mattered to read it, and that I think made the difference. So yeah, and in terms of in terms of the topics that we've covered over here, actually, if you actually go one of them is about just resilience, right? So when the going gets tough, then we have this whole thing about finding hope. Then we also have on loss, like people who've coped crazy amount of loss, like things where you would just lose hope, and now they've come back and done something that normal people wouldn't do. I still remember this one story. This is a couple in Mumbai who had a young son, 26-year-old, who was just taking the local train every day, doing really well. And just because the train was crowded, he got pushed out of the local train and he just hit a pole. You know how the local trains are in Mumbai, hit a pole and kind of just died. And that loss actually went the other way for this elderly couple. And they said, you know what, until now, our purpose was our son. But now we kind of change this and said, we'll make our purpose to just feed the elderly who do not have children who take care of them, or they don't have children to take care of. And they just started that, and they just do catering all across Mumbai for free, giving food to the elderly. This is one of the many stories around loss, which I just thought I'll kind of highlight. And then, of course, there is this whole thing about the power of one. One of the things that I kind of mentioned, how it just takes one person to bring about change. And then the whole flywheel effect starts taking place. And then there is this whole concept of business with a heart. So when we kind of, I've got this power of one here, and I've got this business with a heart part here, which is what, so I wanted to kind of really go a little deeper into that. I'll start with Sandeep. And, when you say business with a heart, right? What does that mean? Like, how do you know this is a for-purpose business, impact business? Like, how do you know this is the one?
I'm still figuring it out. So, to be honest, we can look at metrics and we can look at past performance, but very often we invest at a raw startup stage itself. You can establish parameters by which you're going to track the investment, what data and MIS that an entrepreneur needs to provide, and you can do all of that. But I think the way we found it to be the most effective and powerful is actually to spend time with the entrepreneurs in the field, in the context of their own work. And actually spending that time. And I don't call it a field visit like many people do, because at some level there's an element of poverty tourism associated with that, which is, I think, a little insulting to people who are doing incredible work on the ground. I think it's a little bit of immersion. And there are great stories associated with that immersion where you learn incredible things. I'll give you so it's time, literally time, immersing yourself in communities. So Entrepreneur X is trying to impact community Y, and you go and spend time with Entrepreneur X in community Y, and you kind of gauge what's really happening, and then decide, is this something you want to back? Is there a business model out here? Can it scale? Can it reach millions? And then you go down that path. But I'll give you one, and it's one of my favorite stories. Since we're talking about stories, we decided we wanted to go out and really understand what smartphone usage meant in places like Bihar and Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, since everybody was talking about the importance of the smartphone to the future of impact, leave alone business in a general sense. So this was a few years ago. So we flew into Patna, and then through a combination of road travel and train travel, came down all the way to Chhattisgarh, and then flew back home from there. And at some point of time, our taxi got stuck because there was a traffic jam caused by a truck which had got caught in some mud. And so we were just stuck there for about 45 minutes. And then we saw a jugaad literally on the side of the road, actually making his way. So we stopped him, jumped off. So it's my business partner, Jyotsna, and I were in that jugaad. So she was sitting inside and I was right at the back. And before you knew it, 5 minutes later, there were people hanging off the jugaad, which is so classical India and, the reality of it. And then you started having a conversation. So she's having a conversation with the woman and she talks about, the challenges of family, etc. And that woman in rural Bihar turns around and says, your life is no different than mine, which is just such an incredibly powerful statement. Flip side, I'm talking to this gentleman who's literally hanging out of the jugaad, and I'm asking him about smartphone usage, and he makes this incredible comment. He says, it's people who don't have time and work who are on the smartphone. So I'm like baffled for a moment, because that's the exact counter narrative to the usage of the smartphone that we all have in urban India. And he was like, people who have work don't have the time. And then you realize that the smartphone was an entertainment device. It's nothing else. And actually was a replacement to the television as you dig in, because of power cuts. You charge your phone, you get content, you watch it when you can, even if you don't have power. And so if people are working, they're not actually using the smartphone, they're working. So it was just a fascinating exercise. It actually delayed some of our thoughts on certain ideas that we wanted to invest by a couple of years. just based on that ground up kind of perspective. So we spend a lot of time doing that, both in the context of entrepreneurs who want capital from us, but also just independently because we need to try and attempt keeping our pulse on the ground. The day we lose that touch, I think we won't be very effective as investors. So even the entrepreneurs you back as if they have a view of the world and we share that view that we will back. But sometimes you meet an entrepreneur, great idea, great model, but we don't have an aligned approach on how to address that problem, and we'll stay up at that point.
Got it. No, I
Just
think
a lot
that's
of time on the ground.
Yeah. And, Poonam, coming to this whole power of one, right? I mean, I know we've had I've had this discussion with you earlier, how 15 years ago, the composting nobody knew. And yet you were trying to push this whole thing that this should be done, right? How were the initial years? Like how hard it was and what kept you going?
It was very hard, yeah. But I think the training of the fact, we were taught when we were in college. All of us went to college, right? Remember all those late night discussions about philosophy and metacognition and all of that, right? So we've been through that grind. We also had teachers who said, it was in that day it was fashionable to say you have to work for India. I don't know how fashionable it is now, but it was very clear. Our teachers had that focus. And so that kind of training, right? It was, design is meant to make change happen. And so when you have that mindset and you will trade like that, then you know that you're going to, work at systems level. You're going to try and make impact at the systemic level rather than just the cause and effect. You don't fix the root cause, but you fix the symptom. And so given that background, I think that keeps your resilience going, because you have that as your fall to. You know that you have to go back and say, measure up to whatever you think that makes sense. You set a standard for yourself. So, but it was hard. It was very hard. And what kept us going was the fact that we took risks of the issue. We took something that was externalized by society. We took the risks to build the demand. And to build the demand, we didn't go the route that most people would say, that you take capital up in front and you spend a lot of money to build the demand. We said we do without it. And that kept us going, because if you're lean and you're not worried, then you put all your attention. It's like that farmer, right? He says he puts all his attention on the work. Everything else then becomes noise. And I think that ability to keep the noise out, because otherwise you have to sit and fill forms and convince funders and convince the government or convince somebody. And you don't want to waste time convincing, because you know that you've got something going. So I think that kept us going.
No, that's an interesting point. And I still remember, when we started the Better India, and we came from engineering backgrounds and we had no clue how to run, content and stuff. And we just went and met a whole bunch of editors and, media owners, the established publications. And every single one of them told us, many didn't give us appointment, but those who did actually told us, this won't work. There's nothing in this. Nobody reads this. But fundamentally, both of us believed that, we both wanted to read it. And we realized there were a bunch of people who were reading it, and we were seeing this change happen. And then, so that's when we kind of decided that it's actually good that the larger publications are not looking at it, because I think we'll stay under the radar for as long as possible. And, before they know it, we should be able to kind of, do something around this. So I still remember those early days when there was a lot of complete sort of, that this can't work sort of the thing. And it's fascinating to kind of see that, all of that is now kind of manifested, and we have a book also, and, we've been able to talk about the change that we've brought about. So on that note, I think we're happy to take questions. We have about 5-6 minutes if anybody has questions for anybody here.
Yeah, so hello, Dhimant. I had heard the episode of Getting Meta in which you were the guest. So I know about you from there. So I wanted to know that you had a better home products also. So I try to live zero waste. So I wanted to ask you, when you started like a products, did you think about the circular aspect of it? Like currently the supply chain is linear. So did you ever think about making your products like circular, like handling the end product and waste also?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question.
And I have another question for Poonam ma'am also. So Daily Dump is doing great. Like even I have bought a product for my home last year. And I wanted to ask, did you ever try to collaborate with BBMP because they collect segregated waste. So did you ever try to collaborate with them to check how they handle the wet waste? Yeah.
I'll let
Thank you.
Poonam go ahead. Go ahead.
We've collaborated with the BBMP on several occasions. So the system is really big, right? And it's complex. So part of the wet waste, they are able to send to their central composting units. Part they're not able to. And part of it goes to landfill. Ideally, if everybody composted, then that wouldn't be the case.
Yeah.
But thank you for composting.
Yeah, on the Better Home, the whole circular thing was thought of right from the beginning when we started thinking about the products, right? There was a lot of time that we spent on figuring out the packaging, for instance. And, glass, it has its own carbon footprint issues, it has its own logistics issues. Plastic, then we had to factor in recyclability. And so what we kind of designed was that we said that, let's sell this on subscription so that your first kit comes in plastic bottles, but then you should not throw these plastic bottles in the landfill, keep them, and we will send these refill pouches to you in your subsequent things. And then the subsequent kits would have a self-attested envelope in which you could send those pouches back to us. And we were working with a couple of local NGOs who would upcycle these and make other products out of it. So that was our sort of first attempt at bringing some sort of circularity there. And because we also knew that you're on a subscription model, we were able to ship your second, third, fourth kit by road. So thereby reducing our carbon footprint even more. And just like 3 months ago or 4 months ago, we piloted of having a truck filled with our products going around Mumbai, doing one trip where people could just go and fill their bottles. So we don't have to ship anything from Bangalore and stuff. So absolutely, because that's one of the core tenets of the Better Home was the whole environmental impact that we could bring while this things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions before we wind up?
Yeah, hi, my name is Manu. Great conversation on storytelling. So my question is maybe to all three of you. 3 different backgrounds, 3 different stories, and 3 different purpose maybe. So what is your idea of change and how has that evolved over time?
The tough question, you're giving it to me first. To be very honest, I wouldn't say my theory of change, so to speak, has gone through any fundamental shift. We've always been very focused on essential products and services. And to determine what is essential is you're spending a lot of time with low-income, underserved communities trying to figure out. And the way we do that is by understanding their wallet, their priorities, needs, aspirations, etc. So it's very tangible in that sense. I think what's interesting is from when I started doing this, which is like a decade and a half ago to today, the answers you get when you go into the communities have fundamentally changed. And I think that is amazing. So even Poonam's own journey from nobody knew about composting to people knowing composting. So I think the dramatic shift of people understanding and therefore their aspirations and needs going up has gone through a shift, and that's led to shifts at our end. But let me tell you, I'll give you a story here just very quickly. Can you tell me the asset in some slums of the world that will tell you whether a family inside that slum is more affluent than not? Let's say any slum in any major city in the world. What would be that asset? Can you just guess? Just take one guess.
I didn't get the last part.
An asset that a family owns inside a slum, which may be indicative of the fact that it's better off compared to its neighbors.
Television. Yeah, maybe.
Everybody now owns dish TVs, and it's actually a table very often because it means space, and space means therefore they're more affluent. So sometimes these answers can be very counterintuitive, and you have to be open to that kind of a conversation. Now, of course, that's the only point I would make.
Thanks. Poonam, you want to take that on change? I think just for me, I think over the last decade or so, in terms of the change that we've seen and we've brought about, I think all change starts with a community coming together and a mindset kind of changing towards becoming progressive and wanting to solve a problem. I think it's only when we decide that we want to solve a problem is when we start seeing change. And I think that has been universal. There are just different ways to get there. We use storytelling. They come in with organizations that they support. What she's doing with her idea. I think fundamentally it's about that, right? That's how change happens.
I think I'm more interested. I mean, I was and I still continue to be more interested. I haven't learned fully enough about it, but I think my question is what creates enduring change? What creates change for the most with the least amount of effort? And I think I'm still experimenting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, guys. On that note, we've come to an end. We've run out of time. Thank you so much. Hope this session was enjoyable, and do check out the Book of Hope at the bottom. Thank you. Thanks, Adi. Thanks.